Michigan Justice Chronicles with Dan Geherin takes you inside the courtroom and behind the scenes of criminal defense law, uncovering the strategies, stories, and stakes that define justice in Michigan.
Welcome to Michigan Justice Chronicles with Dan Geherin. I'm Sam Henniger, and I'm excited to dive into conversation with Dan today. We're going to get started learning a bit more about Dan's experience in some high-profile cases. So let me ask you, Dan, as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, what have been some of these high-profile cases you've handled, and how have they shaped your career?
Sam, it's one of the more common questions I get, whether it's from my kids or people I grew up with or at cocktail parties, Thanksgiving dinners. Hey, Dan, any exciting cases right now? And for a number of years, I was sort of resistant to answer that question. There's always confidentiality constraints, and then sometimes I just don't want to necessarily rehash or think I'm boring people with it. But over the years, the last few years especially, I've been more willing to talk about these cases, A, because they can help me sort of learn from the cases, and B, maybe there's some younger lawyers out there that are interested in it too. You know, I get asked all the time, what was it like working on a case that ended up on Dateline? Or what was it like when you had that case that had all the press attention or whatever? And I always say, well, look, you know, you sort of are in that moment and you dial into it and then you move on to the next one. But there are certainly cases over a near three decade career that stand out as being high profile or sensitive. And I'm happy to sort of talk about those to the extent I can.
You mentioned that you had cases covered by Dateline. So let's start there. Why don't you explain what your role was in one of those cases?
So the last few years, there's been two of my cases on Dateline. One was a homicide case in Adrian, Michigan, where a suspect was accused of killing his wife, making her suicide look like murder or murder look like suicide. But the case that no doubt has garnered the most attention, I think probably in my career, is a case about Egypt Covington. And those of us here in Michigan that hear that name know instantly what I'm talking about. In a nutshell, Sam, Egypt was a local songwriter who was murdered in her own home. She was bound up, tied, and unfortunately, sadly, killed execution style back in June of 2017. And the police very quickly zeroed in on and locked in on a young man named Ken and interrogated Ken and let him go, but had every intention of charging him, thinking for certain he was guilty. And probably the smartest thing Ken did was reached out to hire an attorney, and that attorney happened to be me. And so that investigation went on for a number of years, 3 or so to be exact, where Ken was the primary suspect. And each day we feared he was going to be charged until a new police department, the state police, took it over, did their own investigation, and literally within weeks found the actual 3 suspects, charged them, convicted them, and cleared Ken of any wrongdoing, as he should have been from the beginning. So without question, the case I get asked about probably the most here locally is the Egypt Covington case and my role in representing Ken.
That's incredible. For those of us who aren't aware, walk us through a little bit of why the police zeroed in on Ken to begin with, and then how it so quickly transitioned to the actual 3 culprits.
We, of course, had conversations with the police, various officers that were involved in the case, and they kept coming back to 2 facts. And one of those is going to be sort of common sense, and that was Ken was Egypt's ex-boyfriend, right? And for those of us that watch all of these crime shows and CSI and all the Law and Orders know that an ex-boyfriend, an ex-husband, or someone intimately involved in the victim is usually statistically involved. And so there was that element of it, but also they put a lot of stock into a polygraph exam that they claimed Ken did not do well on. Now, whether that's true or not, we could debate until the cows came home, but he was in interrogation for about 13 hours. He was told his ex-girlfriend was brutally murdered. He was scared. He was anxious. And they kept insisting that he must be guilty because he was the ex-boyfriend, because he did not do well, allegedly, on a polygraph. And that was really it. There was no other evidence at that time or subsequently to tie him to the offense, which thankfully is why he wasn't charged, and thankfully why eventually the police did their job and found the actual killers.
Wow. And so knowing that that was the main piece of evidence that they had, what did you do once you stepped in? How did you help in defending Ken?
Yeah, we learned pretty early on in that case, like we do in many, that it just wouldn't do any good to have him continue to talk to the police. They were cynical. They didn't want to listen. They didn't want to hear anything more he had to say. And we were always afraid they were going to put handcuffs on him at some point. And so one of the main and most obvious things we did is did not allow him to talk to the police or vice versa through the investigation, did not let him talk to anybody, media, people on social media, people that were accusing him online and so forth. We didn't allow him to talk to anyone about the case. So shutting that down was important. We also eventually brought on a private investigator that had worked for our firm and then another investigator to help do some things in the background to show that he couldn't have done it. And then lastly, Sam, we volunteered information to the police that frankly they didn't want. The example there is my client said, I was home at the time. You can check the OnStar in my truck. You can pull the black box data to show my truck didn't move. And I remember vividly telling the detective, pull his OnStar, and the detective said they didn't care. They said something along the lines of he could have taken an Uber, he could have walked to her house. And so again, when they locked in and don't listen to any other evidence, there's this confirmation bias that they don't want to listen to anything else. So we were mindful of that, tried to break through that, but ultimately shut him down, kept him away from the police. And that turned out, I think, to be the right strategy.
Wow. So I can imagine that talking to the other side, it can be tough to communicate and talk straight with things. What else did you do to help convince the police that he wasn't guilty?
There wasn't a lot we could do. I mean, that's a great question, and I wish I had a magic bullet answer. But, in my experience, there are some really good detectives out there, and like in any profession. And then those are, they will do their job and they will follow leads where they go. And then there are different detectives, smaller towns, as this was, that I just don't think they have the experience or the desire to look at all of the evidence. They sort of want to glom onto a suspect and jam the facts to fit their scenario. So there really wasn't a lot we could do other than the scenarios I mentioned before, not letting him speak, not letting him talk to the media, trying to keep his spirits up all the time. And then at one point, we would talk to the prosecutor because they're making the ultimate decision, just to remind them of his innocence, remind them that he had strong advocacy here to represent him should they make the terrible decision to charge him with a crime. And that's about all you can do, especially in a high-level homicide investigation that has media coverage and high sensitivity as Egypt's did.
Right. I think that's fairly typical. I think we've seen plenty of stories, news coverage of lawyers doing their best to protect their clients from the media. But I'm wondering, is there anything else or any other ways that you've used media to your advantage?
Yeah, in this case, it took a very strange turn, and you made some good points. In this case, unlike anything I think I've seen, the police released Ken's name to the media, which is why I'm able to at least use his first name as a person of interest. And why they did that, I still don't know. I think they were trying to put pressure on him or pressure on someone else to come forward. So they released his name to the media. And then there was a feeding frenzy of the trucks outside of his house. A Dateline Detroit episode ran naming him. You talk about your reputation being completely ruined and flushed down the toilet. And so our job at that point was to release statements from Ken, from us, that said he is 100% innocent. He cooperated with the police. Here is the evidence that we offered to submit. So that's what you can do if the police release a client's name. And then I mentioned earlier, Sam, there's the possibility of using your own private investigation, your own polygraph exams, trying to find other evidence that might point away. But we are not detectives, despite what I said earlier about maybe wanting to be a detective when I was younger. And so we are sort of left to the private investigators that we might hire or left to our clients to find some information. But that can be very daunting when there's a media frenzy, a prosecution frenzy, and ultimately you're just trying to convince them that the client is 100% not guilty, as Ken was.
That's amazing. And I'm thinking from the perspective of a, say, younger lawyer, someone who doesn't have almost 30 years experience looking at what you were able to do dealing with the high profile, just monster case. What strategies did you find most effective there? What kind of advice would you give more junior lawyers when they come up against these types of situations?
You know, lawyers that want to practice in the criminal justice field, by and large, sort of have a certain personality, almost that caged tiger, get me into the courtroom, get me into the fight. And there's a lot to love about that. I think you've got to be competitive. You've got to want to have that fight. You have to want to be a trial attorney, and that's great. But that same sort of bravado can cause problems for younger attorneys taking on cases that, frankly, they shouldn't. And we've seen examples of that, attorneys who hang their shingle and then a year later are representing someone in a murder case, and they are so over their skis And that's not only an embarrassment to the profession, but let's not forget, you've got someone to your left that might be going to prison for the rest of his life because you're not capable and experienced enough to have that type of media frenzy and that type of complicated prosecution. And so I always say to younger attorneys, volunteer to be a second chair. I'm happy to have you help on a homicide case. And many attorneys before me did that for me. And so you learn the ropes sort of coming up as a second chair. You watch trials. And of course, Sam, you build the muscle memory with lower level cases, misdemeanors and juvenile cases, and up the chain until you are comfortable and you are equipped in the courtroom to handle those types of higher cases. So let's not make your first big trial a homicide trial. I think it takes years and years of practice and muscle memory and experience to get to that point.
Now, I'm thinking of how when you're going up against the government, the United States or state of Michigan versus your client, I can only imagine that it can be quite intimidating. In fact, I know someone who had a case against them, against the Bureau of Land Management at one point, and it can just seem like, where do I even begin? So what has your experience been personally? And then also navigating the relationship, helping your client navigate the case when the other side seems to be this great big system working against them.
Your friend probably felt that, 10 out of 10. And then imagine if it's the FBI on the other side or the state police of a particular jurisdiction, it can be overwhelming. And I always tell clients when they walk in here, it is never going to be an even playing field, really, because the law enforcement budgets and their ability to use their resources is never going to be matched by a client unless their pockets are so deep, like O.J. Simpson, for example, that they can hire teams of lawyers and teams of investigators and teams of experts. And so off the bat, the playing field is not going to be even. The way that it starts to even in the courtroom is to have an attorney or attorneys that have done this before, have had these battles before, can win in the courtroom, because in the courtroom, generally it's prosecutor versus defense attorney, or it's plaintiff's attorney versus defense attorney. And what brought the resources there certainly affect trial, but trial skills and experience matter. And so for someone facing down the huge resources of the government, be it federal or state, I think the only way that they can start to level that playing field, Sam, is to hire an attorney with experience, at least in the courtroom, to try to make that a fairer fight.
And you mentioned before in this conversation and in our previous episode that there's an ecosystem of people who do different types of work. You have your trial attorneys, but you have your private investigators too. One thing I want to hear more about from you is what an expert witness is and how you go about even finding them.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because we talked about the power of the government. They need something done. They need a ballistics check. They need a fingerprint analysis done. They need DNA. They just call their police agency and say, get it done. As defense attorneys, if you need something, you're relying on finding an expert and employing that expert, and the client does that. The law firm does not in a criminal case. I have gone out of pocket at times where a client is either short or can't afford, and sometimes you have to hire your own expert, but the majority is coming from the client. And then you can also ask for court assistance. You can ask for funds from your court for an individual expert. And attorneys that don't utilize experts are really fighting uphill, because you might have a case where it's DNA based, or it's fingerprint based, or it's any number of scientific elements at play. And if you don't have your own expert to present your theory of the case, the judge or jury 9 out of 10 times is going to believe the prosecution's experts. So in my experience, just over all these years, I've developed sort of a network of people that I can trust and rely on. I've got a toxicologist I've known for 20 years. I'll call him up and just ask him a question to see if I'm on the right track. I had a medical examiner we used on homicide cases. Unfortunately, he's passed away. You have to sometimes go out of state and find experts that will give an opinion, but having the network of experts is important. Going to the court for funding is also important, as I mentioned, and then having your client's willingness to retain experts, especially if their freedom and liberty is at stake, that's an important factor as well.
Well, I'm sure having a relationship that goes back 20 years is a great endorsement of that person, but I'm also wanting to know, how do you go about finding those experts, and what kind of qualities or credentials do you look for in them?
So a lot of times it's word of mouth from other attorneys. You might have listservs and so forth for other criminal justice attorneys. You can ask around. In my experience, it's someone maybe I was recommended to years ago. You go and you grow with that person, and as they practice, you practice. And so if they can't take the case, they may know experts in the field. sometimes you can use the old Google engine, right? I mean, I found an expert once, I think he was in California or Arizona, on a gun case, and he testified by Zoom, remote technology at the time. And so you've just got to be creative in what you find. They've got to be experienced. They've got to be reputable. And to me, one of the most important things is they've got to come off well with the judge or jury. You know, if they come off as a hired gun, no pun intended, or they just don't present well, it's not worth the money. They've got to know how to present their theory and their expertise to a jury, no different than we as trial attorneys need to do as well.
You're making me think of all the crime dramas everyone loves watching and how important that can be.
Yeah, it's Sam. It's why I do what I do. You know, criminal justice is never boring. I could never practice wills or employment law or divorce law. And I think there's a reason that those of us that enjoy this and do it for their whole career, there's really nothing better than it. And those crime shows go to show you that there's a public interest in what we do. And I'm happy always to talk about that, especially in things like this podcast.
Right. And I want to know more about what these particular skills that you developed as an attorney over 30 some years, what they are, why they're important, and maybe some that aren't so obvious to the lay person.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We sort of joke in the profession. You do have to have thick skin to be a criminal justice attorney. There's no doubt about that, because you're going to take losses. You're going to have clients that you like that are going to be, whether it's convicted or lose on a Title IX case, or they're going to lose an administrative hearing, or they're going to lose a lawsuit. And you're going to absorb losses. No one is perfect. Even prosecutors with all of their resources are going to lose some cases. And you've got to learn to take on the next play like a good athlete or a good place kicker or whatever the analogy you want to use. So thick skin. And then, of course, you have to want to do this. You know, attorneys will sometimes send us resumes and say, I want to be a criminal justice attorney. And it's pretty clear after they do it for a year, that's not really what they're cut out for. It's not really what they want. They're better served in transactional law, labor law, boring areas of law, with due respect. And then, of course, to me, you've got to have the trial skills. Any given case that comes in, whether it's a drunk driving case, a misdemeanor case, a murder case, a Title IX case, has the potential of going to trial or going to a hearing. And if you are not equipped to handle that, if you don't have the experience in the courtroom or in the hearings to represent that client in that type of case, you're just not doing them a service. So thick skin, a desire and a zeal for this, and trial skills are probably the three most important skills that come to my mind.
You had mentioned how for younger attorneys, there's a great opportunity to basically get mentored, work that second chair, as you said, and help out volunteering as much as you can on cases that you may not take all by yourself. But I'm thinking about the first time an attorney heads up, say, a high-profile homicide case. What advice would you give to them about those unique challenges?
Yeah, there's nothing quite like that, right? I mean, that you talk about swimming in the deep end. You hopefully have the experience under your belt. You have the comfort under your belt, but let's not fool ourselves. You're walking into a courtroom on a homicide trial with the press cameras in the back and the consequences staring down your client. It is no joke. And I do remember one of the first homicide cases I did as a defense attorney. It was coincidentally the week my now 21-year-old son was being born. And so I had the pressure of being a dad, first-time dad, but putting that aside and trying to focus on a 3-week-long trial where my client was accused of a pretty serious, obviously serious murder case. So I talk about muscle memory. I talk about habit. I talk about those things that got you to that point. But without question, Sam, the number one fact, whether it's a homicide case or anything lesser, is use your preparation. The preparation that has gotten you to that point, it doesn't change. It's going to be more intensive, of course, time consuming for a homicide, but how you prepare for a case, how you break it down, how you use those preparation skills are going to be uniform. And regardless of the type of case you have, it's just going to be that times a million when you're walking into your first homicide case.
This has been Michigan Justice Chronicles with Dan Geherin. I'm Sam Henninger. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, because we're going to have a lot more great conversations just like this. Dan, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Sam. I appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.